we've seen a ton of unity in the community. We had a big social, just kind of a thank you to the volunteers and, like everyone that's been out helping on the trails at the hub a couple of weeks ago, and it was packed. And, one of the people at the hub said to me is like, this is something I've been waiting for years to see.
Welcome to Trail Effect. I am your host, Josh Blum. Trail Effect is a show that dives into the stories behind trails, the communities that embrace trails, and the people who rely on trails as a way of life. The goal of this show is to turn the stories you will hear from our guests into useful knowledge that can be applied to your community while providing some entertaining and inspirational content. Guests on Trail Effect include trail builders, board members, community leaders, volunteers, and regular people who really enjoy trails. For episode 182, we have Daniel Sapp back on. This time, Daniel will provide some insight around the impacts that Hurricane Helene had on Western North Carolina and the communities around Pisgah National Forest. Western North Carolina relies heavily on tourism. Please consider supporting these communities and organizations in any way that you see fit as they clean up, reopen, and rebuild. With that, we're jumping right into this episode with Daniel Sapp from Pisgah area SORBA. Here we are today on Trail Effect. I've got Daniel Sapp back. This time we're going to talk about Hurricane Helene. And for those who aren't familiar, Daniel is the president of Pisgah area SORBA in the greater Asheville, North Carolina region. I think we'll use that as the main community because it is the largest population center in that region, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, the next closest would be Charlotte or Atlanta or Knoxville.
And that's a ways away.
It is.
While Knoxville might have gotten a little bit of Hurricane Helene, I'm fairly certain.
I think they ended up all right. I think it's a little bit east of them.
Yeah, so they didn't see the impacts that you guys saw. But let's get into what has happened since in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. I think at this point, a lot of people know what Hurricane Helene was, and maybe they don't. Maybe you could quick talk about what actually happened in terms of volumes of rain that fell. And then let's get into the greater good of the community and how it's impacted the community more specifically rather than just going into mountain bike trails.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So it was kind of a perfect storm, except everything about it was not perfect. There was a weather system that moved through a day or two before the hurricane came up and, just brought a ton of rain. That on its own would have been a significant amount of rain. There was flooding already. I actually got in from a trip. I was out in Colorado and, a day or two before we came back, started hearing stuff about the hurricane, and we get hurricanes sometimes, or, the remnants of them typically. And it ends up being a ton of rain and flooding and everything. And, it was supposed to be up our way Thursday, Friday of that week. I got back Wednesday. I'm like, oh, we should go to the store because they were forecasting it to be bad, by all measures. And the forecast just kept going up and up. And I went over to Hendersonville. We live between Hendersonville and Brevard, and went to the store. And by the time I'd been in the grocery store for 30 minutes, it was, full on downpour. And they come over the intercom. They're like, hey, if your car's in this part of the parking lot, you need to move it. Cars are floating away. And it's like, oh, wow, okay, it's getting bad. And, I drove back home, but there are multiple places, water just coming over the front of the car and everything. And, it's by any measures that happens here and there. It's the mountains, it rains, water goes to the valleys, things fill up, things flood. But, the ground was super saturated already. And so with all that rain that had already happened, then the hurricane comes and dumps an insane amount of additional water. I think at our house, we ended up with over 20 inches of rain, and we were lucky compared to some places, that had upwards of 30 inches of rain. And this is over a couple day period. So it was a really bad situation, tons of catastrophic flooding. I think biblical is the most accurate description anyone's given it from what I could tell. It's just, unless you've been here and seen the damage and devastation, it's absolutely impossible to comprehend it. And no matter how much you've seen on the news or what you've heard, it's that bad. And I think the widespread scale of the damage, I mean, there are entire towns, like Chimney Rock was washed away into Lake Lure. And, places, I grew up in North Carolina. I've lived here my whole life. And, places that I've gone for my whole life are not there anymore, very drastically altered. And just the sheer force, the amount of water, and then, we have had floods before. When the remnants of Hurricane Fred came through 3 years ago, there was significant flooding and there was significant damage in areas. And like by all measures, that was the storm of the century. And this came, and this was a whole nother level. The damage from Hurricane Fred was somewhat isolated comparatively. It was isolated if you look at, Pisgah National Forest, southwest of Brevard, that area of Pisgah, kind of isolated over Black Balsam, Shining Rock Wilderness, the East Fork, and, kind of those mountains right there. And the water just kind of came down the Davidson River and then down the East Fork and, caused severe damage on either side there. But this, that's 2% of the area that Helene damaged. I can get in the car and drive for 3 hours and still be in areas that are absolutely destroyed, which is kind of, and it's hard to comprehend.
I'm sure you probably couldn't see everything that was on the news. One, because there's so many different news sources today, but two, because you're effectively cut off, from a communications perspective. But could you kind of explain, as best as you know, what the public may have seen versus what reality is?
Well, back to how we were cut off from communication, our neighborhood, we're luckily up off the valley floor a little bit on the side of the mountain, and we have a view of the Little River Valley, which is the valley between kind of Pisgah Forest and DuPont State Forest, essentially. And, the whole thing was filled with water. Yeah, it was wild to see. And, we couldn't even get out of our neighborhood for a day or two because Crab Creek, the creek that flows down Crab Creek Road or beside Crab Creek Road, was flooded. I mean, we had a lake a quarter mile across when, usually it's a stream that is 20 feet wide. And so the water levels rose 10, 15 feet easily just right here in the valley. So we weren't seeing much of anything. We were all just doing our thing in the neighborhood. We started clearing roads, cutting trees out, stuff like that. Then we get around, and I actually got out of the neighborhood and went over to a buddy's who was out of town to get some more fuel for the generator because we were kind of flooded into the valley essentially. And so we went some back roads and way up over Pinnacle Mountain and, was able to get some fuel. But then I also got phone service because I was on the state line, kind of like where it drops off to South Carolina. And I think we were getting, some cell phone service from Greenville because all the cell phone towers were down here. There's no power, no internet, no cell phone, nothing. It started to be, wow, the news is really bad. Like as bad as it is here, it's way worse in other places. And I think all those reports really didn't come in for a while because just the lack of communications. No one in these hard hit areas was able to communicate to say, hey, this is what's going on and everything. And I think I've seen more in the past 2 or 3 weeks popping up online that I've not seen before than, in the first week or two. But, back to your question, what's different, it being here on the ground and what people are seeing on the news. And I think there's a lot of overlap. I think a lot of it is the same, but, I think one of the big things that I noticed was right where we're at, we were lucky. We didn't have any damage to our house. And most of the people in the Brevard area were fairly lucky. The further east and north and south you get, where the storm really tracked and brought more and more rain, and also further down in the basins of the rivers, there was significantly more damage. And those places are still really bad off. I think the news is kind of moved on at this point. We're at 6 weeks, I think, since the storm. And the news has forgotten it in a lot of ways. I mean, there's been the election and everything else, but many of these places are still in terrible shape. It's really hard to put into words how bad off it is. I was in Old Fort last week, and there's logging equipment in downtown, logging trucks pulling logs off the roads. And, there was a house laying in the middle of a street. And that was 5 weeks later. And the fact that they had just gotten to where they're doing that at 5 weeks should, that kind of paints a picture of how bad things are.
It's a pretty obvious fact that the community in the region is never going to be the same again. But at the very least, it's going to be a 5 to 10, maybe longer year effort to get things back to where not like we just said, it's never going to be the same. So normal is there's a new normal, right?
Right.
But it's going to be years
I think everything
happens. Yeah.
Everything we think of now is kind of before and after the storm. And, before just seems like this whole other world. It's wild. I still can't comprehend it myself. And I've not been it. Luckily, we don't live in one of the hardest hit areas, but we do live in an area that's been hard hit. And we're very close to the very hard hit areas. And I have been there and I have been in some of those areas. And it's a lot to wrap your head around. I've never seen anything like this before. And I hope I never see anything like this again. Yeah.
In my old profession, I worked 5, we'll say 100-year flooding events from a DOT perspective where houses, were lost. Rivers went way above their flood stage and, stuff like we're talking about. But I'm going to tell you the stuff that I saw that I had to, document from a professional level for FEMA and for FHWA and stuff like that versus the stuff that I just saw on the news. It's like not even close to the same. And so when I see that, knowing what I've seen with firsthand and I see what I've only seen on the news from your place, it's truly unbelievable.
It's crazy. I mean, and it's really bad. I think that's the thing, people's lives are forever changed and, the effects are still coming, but it's, even this week I was driving east on Interstate 40 out of Asheville, down into the Piedmont. And it's just every morning there's just thousands of work trucks coming up, dump trucks coming up full of rock, and then they're leaving full of debris. And, pieces of infrastructure, the amount of infrastructure damage is unreal. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of miles of road are gone. And, it's not just back roads. I mean, those were certainly some of the most heavily damaged roads, but, even a couple of the major interstates, I-26 washed away in one place. I-40 fell into the river in one place. It's wild. And I mean, then you look at the damage in the national forest, which, to give some perspective, Pisgah National Forest is a really large tract of land. You're looking at 500,000 plus acres. And that stretches essentially from where we are in Brevard, down in our area. It goes north and east, up through Asheville, up through Spruce Pine, Burnsville, Black Mountain area, Old Fort, Wilson Creek area, and those small communities in there, and up into Boone. And so, in the national forest, the damage is very, very bad.
Let's spin this into a little bit more of a positive.
Yeah. There has been a lot positive. I almost jumped into that for a second.
But let's go into, so right out of the gate, no one's allowed in Pisgah National Forest until the people in charge of Pisgah National Forest allow people to go into it, including volunteers and employees and everyone that could be doing work from Pisgah area SORBA and other volunteer groups in the region. Let's talk about the therapeutic side of things when you were allowed to go back into the forest, start assessing damage, and then start figuring out a work plan to actually get stuff open back up.
Yeah. So it was, I want to say 2, maybe 3 weeks after the storm before we were allowed back in. And, a lot of it was the National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service, and the land managers in charge of the National Forest. Like, everyone was dealing with a ton of stuff. Like, everyone had trees down on their houses or a neighbor's house, or no one had water. The city of Asheville still doesn't have potable water. They have to, be drinking bottled water, and their whole water system got wiped out. And, the first course of action for everyone was like, let's take care of the people and the communities. And, for Pisgah area SORBA, we were the same thing. As soon as we were able to communicate with each other at all, we started finding out who had Starlink nearby, and, everyone would go use the Starlink. And, be able to communicate with other people that could do the same. And it was like, oh, we're going to take care of people in communities first. And so, a number of our sawyers were out clearing roads to get into communities and to get people out. And, it's kind of a cool thing to see, the community coming together and just everyone that had any sort of a skill that they could use, they were using it. And it's like, okay, this person's good with a chainsaw. Where are they? They're out clearing roads. It's not for a lack of, local, state, federal response or anything. It's just like the sheer magnitude of the destruction everyone was needed. Everyone had to help. And for the first 2 weeks, it's kind of a time thing. There were still people that had to be rescued and cut out and everything else. And so, everyone's focused on that. Then it's like, okay, what about the National Forest? So in the National Forest, there are communities and there are roads that go to people's houses and properties and stuff. And so the first goal of the Forest Service was to get those roads open. And they had an incident team come in. And, this incident team has only been allocated for fire damage and, major wildfires. That's the only thing that they've done in the history of the U.S. Forest Service. So this was the first major event other than a fire that they were put on. And, they came in and they got roads opened and everything else. But a lot of that was just in the Pisgah Ranger District. So the Pisgah Ranger District where we are is, the area near Brevard and Asheville, southwest. The other districts were more heavily damaged. And so the priorities and just where resources could go was not everywhere. A lot of it was focused here. And so they got those roads open. And then they, at a point when that team was done, and they just went away when they're done. That's it. The local Forest Service doesn't get any more help at that point. And then we had a meeting and we got some volunteers in and started clearing trail. And that's, again, that's just in our district. The Grandfather Ranger District, which is, the Old Fort area up toward Boone, and then the Appalachian Ranger District, which is kind of north of Mount Mitchell and that whole area, Big Ivy. Those districts are still closed. There are no people allowed in there right now. The damage is so bad.
So I got two topics I want to move on to, and I'm not quite sure what one I want to go to first. Actually, let's go to the chainsaw topic first. So just so everyone knows, like Bob with a chainsaw at his house can't just take his chainsaw into the National Forest and use it.
That's correct. I mean, it's a terrible idea too. Yeah, to work in the forest, you have to have a USDA saw card. And, you have to have gone through a multi-day training and be competent and, someone that is an expert in the field sign off on you being competent and safe. It's a big deal. And I mean, I think the Asheville ER had, like a couple dozen chainsaw injuries in the first, week of everything. And, you think about chainsaw injury, that's not one you want. It's not a paper cut. And so it's kind of tricky. You only have a limited number of volunteers that can go in and do this kind of work.
And with that, I was informed by Craig, your predecessor, that at Camp Greer, Jeremy Poore and others were able to host another chainsaw safety U.S. Forest Service certification course. Is that correct?
They did get a whole nother round of people certified. I know they have a number of other classes upcoming. And so, we really pushed for that to happen because we had, we opened up a volunteer sign up and we had over 1,000 people sign up to volunteer. And a lot of people wanted to get their chainsaw certification. And I think some of the enthusiasm for that has waned in the last couple of weeks because most of the trails in this area are open at this point. But, it's been really cool to see how many people want to get involved. And, it's awesome of Jeremy and the whole crew down there for getting that set up, getting more people out.
Well, and you'd mentioned earlier that Old Fort is still in a really, really tough space. Like, what did that mean for them to be able to offer something like that when their community, it's closed still, essentially? Or not the community isn't closed, but the National Forest is closed and they're still hauling logs out of like main areas of transportation.
Yeah, rebuilding roads. I think it's awesome. And I think it's also kind of this recovery process is going to go on for a very long time. And, where people can bring some normalcy back, they are. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing, and this is certainly, very much needed service. And so it's awesome to see him doing that.
Let's go into the closed part, because one of the things that people might be tempted to do is go into areas that are closed. And why is it important to not go into areas that are closed?
Well, it's a terrible idea for one. Well, there's people that are still picking up the pieces of their lives. One story, I was in one of the closed area with U.S. Forest Service personnel, so it wasn't, close to us. We were there on official business, and we were, putting some barricades out down in the Old Fort area. We were helping them do that, and then just going up and checking out kind of what the status of things are. It helps for, to get an assessment of areas to see kind of, okay, here's what the path forward is, here's why. And, also it gives me, I can come talk to you and help share kind of what things are like on the ground. We talked to this one lady, and she's like, yeah, my neighbor, his house slid on him. He was trapped for 28 hours, laying in a pool of kerosene. He has, like these crazy, chemical burns all over his body. He's still in the hospital. They bulldozed his house this week, what was left of it. And so he's going to come back to no house. I think he's probably staying with her at this point. But, that's kind of right at, some of the main trails in this Old Fort area. And, if that's what some people are dealing with there, the last thing they need are people going in and trying to recreate. She expressed some frustration at a few gravel riders coming by, and, she's like, yeah, if they're nice, I'll tell them that you can't go any further. If they're not, I'll just let them get up there and figure it out for themselves. But, bridges are gone, roads are gone. It's not something, a lot of these places, you can't drag your bike through it. You can't even find the trails in that area. There are some you can, but a number of them are like, oh, I think that trail's around here. Oh, there's a sign. We can see, the old Carsonite sign. But just trees down everywhere. It took us, an hour and a half to hike up one road where there were multiple landslides and, debris flows and trees down and everything else. And it was only a mile. So, and we were on foot without bikes or anything. So it's just those areas, the infrastructure is heavily damaged. They're going to let volunteers in as they can, but they also don't want people getting in and getting in trouble and getting into a place where they need rescue. Cell phones have never worked in most of the forest. So, it's not somewhere you can go and call out. It was kind of surreal for us to be scrambling down through some rocks and, across a slide and, going through a river where the road used to be, thinking like, okay, we're at least an hour and a half under best case conditions from being able to get out. And normally you would consider that out because you're on the road. And so you just can't go back there. I mean, it is idiotic too. A lot of the storm damage is way different than just dropping trees in your backyard. All these trees are bound up. They have a ton of energy stored in them in whatever way they're bent and twisted. And it's not straightforward chainsaw work. There's nothing straightforward about any of it. So if the areas are closed, there's a reason.
Yeah. Let's go back to the Ranger District.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the volunteers and the hours that were logged to get that open, and relative to maybe a regular year of volunteering.
Sure. So we got the go ahead on a Thursday. We had a meeting with the Forest Service, and I think this was 3 weeks ago now. Yeah, it was 3 weeks ago now. And it opened Friday 3 weeks ago. And when it opened to whoever. And, that's when volunteers were able to get in as well. And so our volunteers with Pisgah area SORBA got in and they got to work. We have Jared Hartman, who is our paid trails coordinator. He organized, led work days. We all helped organize too. Myself, other volunteers, and then our other paid staff. In the first 3 days, and I think I'll get this pretty close, we cleared over 300 something trees. And I mean, these are big, complicated trees. A lot of them are, complex cuts and, not straightforward. Some of them are, straightforward, but it's definitely a big spread. And yeah, started getting trails open. It's interesting, you go down a trail and, some places seem totally fine. And then you get to other places that are just totally destroyed. And, just with trees and debris and everything else. And luckily we didn't have a ton of landslides in this district. There were, there's definitely a handful that will take some major work, but our volunteers got in and did a ton of work right off the bat. And, even before the next Monday, when we got the official, information from the Forest Service of how they wanted stuff tracked and everything else, it's like, well, we've already opened up half the ranger district. I think you look at the first week and a half, 2 weeks, and it was between 1,500 and 2,000 volunteer hours that went in, and over 500 trees cut out. And that doesn't mean, not all the tread's been repaired. There's still landslides that are an issue and debris flows and things like that. But the majority of the trails in the Pisgah Ranger District are now open. And, I do think the majority of that work was done by Pisgah area SORBA, but we also had a lot of help from other volunteer organizations. The Backcountry Horsemen, we did a collaboration with them last week, where actually is this week. Time's a funny thing. But, went in and got into some of the more remote areas that it's, kind of hard to get into with just bikes, especially with the bridges out, in the Turkey Pen, South Mills area. And, then the Pisgah Cowboys, that group, it's a few volunteers. They are a smaller organization. They're mountain bikers, but, they're certified by the Forest Service. It's actually the former district ranger is one of them. And they're out there cutting as well. And, we're all just sharing resources and, like, hey, what do you think about going up here that day or that? And, Jared's been coordinating and leading all that. We were able to bring in another, temporary and, hopefully going to be permanent, trail crew person. And so, everyone's getting stuff done, and just the amount of volunteer support has been insane. We had, like I mentioned, we had over 1,000 people sign up to volunteer. And obviously we can't take 1,000 people out there on the trail. That would be interesting. But the work days, I think we're going for a 1-to-6, 1-to-7-ish ratio from, trail crew leader or sawyer to volunteer. They're all volunteers, right? But the people that have the training and are checked off, and people that don't, because there's always people, you need to brush trails and, drag stuff and everything else. And it's just been tremendous, the amount of people out there getting stuff done. And I think every time that we put out, hey, there's going to be a work day or anything like that online, the work days fill up in a matter of minutes now, which is really, really cool. And I know you had asked, what's that look like? What do those hours look like compared to a normal year? And the hours that were done in, a week and a half, 2 weeks are equivalent to about what you would do in a quarter. And so, and at this point, I haven't looked at numbers this week, and I know it's still been going strong. I mean, we've probably done a half a year's worth of volunteer hours in a month, which is, remarkable.
Yeah. And that's probably brought the whole riding community and people that recreate in Pisgah National Forest a lot closer together, right?
It has. That's been a silver lining in all of this. I think the last time we talked, I definitely expressed some, frustration with the lack of unity in the community, and, people coming together and just, people bickering over silly things that don't matter. And we've seen a ton of unity in the community. We had a big social, just kind of a thank you to the volunteers and, like everyone that's been out helping on the trails at the hub a couple of weeks ago, and it was packed. And, one of the people at the hub said to me, is like, this is something I've been waiting for years to see, this much unity in the community. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Cool. I've been waiting for it too. It's one of the reasons I'm doing what I do and why I'm volunteering and, working with Pisgah area SORBA is I know that there can be this unity, and a lot more gets done with a cohesive voice. And I think that it's been a complete 180. It's been really awesome to see.
So there's probably a fine balance to strike, because a lot of your region does depend on tourism, right?
Absolutely. It's the whole region depends on it.
And so as it is today, or even going into the winter, how should people view this? Obviously you need money to come back into the community to get these businesses moving. But what's the responsible way about, coming back into the the Ranger District?
Just come on at this point. And I think it's confusing, right? Because when the news was so current and this was at the forefront of everything, it was very clear that people should not come here. I think that could not be more clear. And, people were getting turned away, or, there's tons of rumors and conspiracy theories going around too, as tends to happen these days. But It's like, there's nowhere to stay. You can't do this or that. And, people will run you off. And that's not the case. Please, people, come visit. Don't go visit the places that aren't open, like Spruce Pine, Burnsville. I don't think they're open yet. They may be soon, but there are places to visit and there are places to not visit. And as a whole, most of Western North Carolina is open and needs people to visit. It's been scary and wild to see how few people are here right now, even after, the Ranger District's been open for going on 3 weeks now, and just people aren't coming. We're starting to get a little bit back. DuPont State Forest is open again. And so kind of all the trails right in this Brevard, Hendersonville, southwest of Asheville area are open. It's totally fine to come visit. Asheville still has some water issues. And so that's tricky. We found out we went up to Asheville last weekend and we're like, oh, well, we can get a coffee. No, you can't get coffee at a lot of places, or, you can't get, we're trying to get a fruit cup for our 3-year-old. She was hungry and hadn't eaten. And she's like, oh, I want a fruit cup. And it's like, okay, we'll run in here and get fruit from Chick-fil-A, of all places. And they're like, yeah, we don't have fruit. So it's like, all right, well, you're going to eat waffle fries for dinner. And so, it's tricky in some places, but you come down to Brevard and it's like, it's very much back to normal. Restaurants are open. Businesses are open. Businesses need people. We're hearing like every day about a business in Asheville or that area closing because just they can't do it.
Well, and speaking of businesses, there are also 2 mountain bike specific trail businesses that are in the region that are open as well, which are Ride Rock Creek and Ride Canuga, correct?
Yeah. Callie, Nico, David, and crew, they got everything good to go. And so they were actually ready. They didn't have a ton of damage to begin with. I think there was some tree damage, and then at Rock Creek, it was some erosion and whatnot. I mean, Nico came back and he's like, oh, it's good. I think someone was like, oh, it's good to go. And then he got back and it's like, it's maybe needs a little bit of work. Just fix some of the wheel swallowing ruts. But they got really lucky and, they're on the good side of things. And so they're open, back in business. They were actually open before, I think, the National Forest. And they coordinated with, Henderson County Search and Rescue and the EMS and everyone and made sure like, hey, it's okay if we open because, no one wanted to tax resources that were being used elsewhere. And so once we were past the rescue and recovery phase where people were still looking for people out in the woods at some of these, further out locations and, smaller communities, they're like, all right, let's get it open. Recreation is so important for the economy here. It's unreal how much of the economy depends on it. No one comes to Asheville and, Western North Carolina to go to strip malls and, our outlets. We have outlets, but they're pretty sad. And so, it's the recreation, it's the mountains that bring people here. And, when the mountains are closed, people just stop coming. And it's just this domino effect. Even if someone has nothing to do with tourism and doesn't like the people being here, places that they go depend on tourism, the gas stations, every restaurant, it's just this trickle down thing, and if those people can't support, if those people's businesses aren't supported, then they can't stay open. And it's just one after the other. It's not a good situation.
Well, and how about the businesses that have started campaigns to fundraise? I think Industry 9 did. I know Defeat Socks, they did, this big sock sale that says, from Mountain Strong. And I'm fairly certain there's other, and even Nico is doing a bike raffle. There's a bunch of stuff going on to help. What are ways people can help that, especially that are not in the area?
I mean, there's a lot of ways people can help. I mean, I think, a few weeks ago and even now, just make sure you're spreading accurate information. There's so much misinformation out there. That was one of the most frustrating things. And, I think we're still dealing with that. Social media is funny. It doesn't always show. The first thing you see is not always the date something was published or, the source. It's just these catastrophic photos or whatever else. And, Wallace said, and, the area that was devastated is very large, but the area that is recovered is also very large at this point. And while it's not recovered back to what it was, it's recovered to, really good levels. And, it's like you would want to visit at this point where it's okay to. And, I think people can help by sharing accurate information, looking at businesses and people that are in the Asheville area and thinking about, hey, how could I support these people? It's like, okay, maybe this place is somewhere I should get a gift certificate for someone to go for Christmas, or I can buy, there's a ton of artists in Asheville, and, it's a very artist-based community, especially the River Arts District, which was totally wiped out. I was like, yeah, buy something from some of these people for Christmas, like spend your money here. I don't like asking for people to spend money on stuff typically. I'm not, but yeah, spend your money here.
Yeah. Well, it's important, I mean, there's like we talked about at the beginning, it's going to be years before things, get really back to, daily life, right? The way it was before.
It will be. Yeah. It's going to take a really long time. And I think it's forever changed the region. I've heard it called the biggest geological disaster in U.S. history. And I do think that's accurate. And it's people act differently. People think differently now. Everyone kind of has this different perspective on things if they've been up here and been dealing with all this. And, my perspective is my perspective. We were super fortunate and didn't have any damage to our house. We had a landslide in our neighborhood, but, I know people that have had severe damage to their homes, and, people that have really had their businesses struggling and, other stuff. And so everyone's perspective is a little different. And so I think it's important to recognize that and, be respectful of that too.
So we're recording this on November 15th, 2024. Usually I don't timestamp things, but we're timestamping this one. We're about a half a month or a couple weeks away from what people affectionately know as Giving Tuesday.
Yeah.
And so this will be out before that Giving Tuesday campaign. Does Pisgah area SORBA or any other organizations in the community really do the Giving Tuesday? I know, like,
we are.
It's a huge thing.
Yeah, we'll be doing a big thing for Giving Tuesday with Pisgah area SORBA, and and there's a number of other great organizations that will be doing stuff too. What I've told everyone, and kind of where we are right now with stuff, is like, we've gotten trails a lot better here. There's still a ton of work that needs to be done. There's some major work that needs to be done, but we're also working with other partner organizations at this point because we are set up in a really good capacity. We have a ton of volunteers. We have paid staff now, which can help organize the volunteers and make things happen. And so we are working with other organizations in surrounding communities to get additional trails open that aren't typically in our area that we work in. And so we certainly need support. There are other people that need support. Northwest North Carolina Mountain Bike Alliance is an awesome organization. G5 Trail Collective, they're amazing as well. And they're doing a ton of work for Old Fort and trying to bring that community back. They were really into this huge upswing, getting trails and getting businesses in the community. And then they just got devastated. And so, there's a number of organizations, and, those three that I named are certainly good ones to get back to.
You brought up a good point that I was going to ask you about earlier, and we kind of didn't get to that point, which is the difference of having paid staff at Pisgah area SORBA now versus a few years ago when you didn't have paid staff. What do you think these efforts would be like? What has that difference been for you guys as an organization to get things organized and to be more efficient?
It's been 100% difference. There's zero chance we would have nearly as many trails open at this point if we did not have paid staff. There's no way volunteer led can be that organized. And it's not only that, but it's the rapport we have with land managers, with the Forest Service. They trust us. We were the first people that they called. I won't say that. We were some of the first people that were called. And it's like, hey, let's figure out a plan. Let's get these trails open. And we're in constant communication with them. And that's the biggest thing. It's not like, well, I wonder who the volunteer, that's going to roll onto the board next year is, or whatever else, or, who's the volunteer in this area. There's just a point person, and we're able to coordinate. They know that we can get out there and do things safely. That's one of the biggest top concerns they have, is just making sure everything is done safely, because it's sketchy work clearing trails from storm damage. And especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere. If you cut your leg with a chainsaw and you're not wearing any protective gear or anything like that, and you're just bleeding out, in a hurry, not much that can be done. And so having that trust with them has enabled us to go in and do the work that we need. We've been able to get the resources that we need, and we've been able to use the equipment that we need to use to get the trails cleared.
One more question, and then we'll wrap this one up. Have you noticed, so there's been a handful of trails that have been rebuilt in recent years in your region. Have you noticed a difference of, and I do have to preface this, some, if not all of the old trails weren't actually like truly built to be trails, I'm guessing.
No, they were, it's just where the cows walked, you know?
Yeah, it was like, I mean, it was a social trail for all practical purposes, right?
Right. I mean, it's funny. Like some of it's old logging roads, you know, some of some of the trails are old. Yeah. Old cattle pass. You know, I think the old Black Mountain Trail was a fence line, but modern trail building is a newer thing for us.
How have the modern trails been that have been built in the area? You had the Black Mountain Trail. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we just had Butter Gap this year, and you've had other trails as well that have been, you know, rebuilt. Maybe they only kept the name in some cases.
Right. It's totally different trail, but same name.
Yeah.
Those two trails you mentioned, Black and Butter, those are fine. No damage. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to say, like, does that have anything to do with modern trail building techniques or not? But they didn't have any damage. You know, a number of the other trails in those areas also didn't have damage. But, you know, besides trees that were down. But it does seem, you know, looking into the grandfather district, we've not even seen the Appalachian district yet, but a lot of the more modern trail building is holding up really well. I don't want to go on record and say it's way better, but it seems to be, it's being very positively received by the Forest Service. And they're like, okay, so this did work. And they are documenting, you know, what do these slope failures look like? And what do, you know, where are these debris flows starting and things like that? Because a lot of times you see landslides and slope failures where, you know, the soil's been disturbed. I'm sure that someone in a geology department somewhere is going to be like, you're saying this all wrong. But, you know, where vegetation and soil is disturbed, it's more likely to fail. And, you know, some of these older roads and older trails have had a number of failures, and we've not seen as many. There have been some on some of the newer trails in the grandfather district, but it's pretty isolated. It seems largely that the new trail work's holding up very, very well.
Well, I think from a blanket statement across all builders, you know, we're a lot more mindful of what the slope of a trail is, and a lot more mindful of what, you know, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for those slopes.
Right, 100%. And, you know, I think they are looking at where all these failures occur, where they occurred, what the slope of the trail is, you know, what the slope of the side hill is, and everything else. And so, you know, I think we'll get some science out of this. It's really cool. Lisa Jennings down in the grandfather district, she's very data heavy on what she does, and she really understands data well and likes to use it, which is awesome because, you know, data is what sells anything to anyone, and it's the facts. And so I know they're doing a really good job down there of, you know, documenting, okay, here's where this happened, here's how this happened. And, you know, it'd be cool to learn some from that. I'm sure there's going to be some research studies coming out of this.
Yeah. And that'd be really good to see, you know. I mean, obviously the first thing that's going to come out of this is just getting people back to normal. But if there can be some other evidence out of this that supports, you know, future trail work and being done in a responsible fashion, I think everybody, again, wins, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I was extremely pleased to get a call from someone that had been out and it's like, hey, there's no issue with Butter, you know, and these other trails, like, there's no issue there. And it's like, all right, it's going to be okay, you know, because it very well could have all washed away. And it very well could have been, if that storm tracked 20 miles to the west, that it would be totally different on those trails as well. But it's a pretty positive thing for modern trail building that is intentional and, you know, thought out.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, do you have any closing comments that you want to throw in there quick that we didn't, or topics that we maybe didn't touch on that you wanted to get out there?
No, I mean, I just think it's been amazing, the community that's come together, and, you know, just seeing people supportive of, you know, each other and each other's well-being. And, you know, everyone understands that the trails are such an important part of the economy. And that's why we've been really working to get the trails opened as we can. And, you know, if we can get the trails open and the economy back going, then things will be all right. But it's a long journey. And I mean, like I said, Pisgah Ranger District Asheville toward Brevard, is open, and you look at the amount of damage that happened in all these areas. And what the Forest Service is saying is about 30% of the infrastructure in the Ranger District was severely damaged or destroyed. And so when you look at infrastructure, that's roads, bridges, and developed recreation sites. And then you go over to the Grandfather District, and 70% of that infrastructure was destroyed. So it's a huge, huge difference. But then you go up to the Appalachian District, that's where Big Ivy is, and 90% of it was destroyed. And so I've heard people say, I've not heard any official report, but like the Big Ivy area people are saying like catastrophically damaged, will not recover. What that means, that's still open for interpretation and, to learn more. But I think they're really working to get the areas that they can open fast as possible. And we're working to support all those efforts because the Forest Service just doesn't have a ton of resources. And so they're leaning heavily on volunteers and, these volunteer organizations. We have paid staff, and that's able to allow us, that paid staff allows us to take, a lot of resources and volunteers and organize them in a safe and effective manner and get a ton of work done. So it's been cool to be able to do that. But, we suffered way less damage here than they suffered in Grandfather and Appalachian. And so it's, and especially like even over at Lake Lure, obviously that whole area was decimated, but we were talking with Conserving Carolina about, okay, how can we go in and get Buffalo Creek and the Weed Patch Mountain Trail and all of these things opened up over there for them. So.
Well, I think you summed it up perfectly early on or about halfway through this conversation when you said unity in the community, right?
Yeah. And I mean, that has been the silver lining and the coolest thing to see in all of this is just how many people have come together and how many people are just, people that used to kind of get upset at things or, maybe it's like, oh, this person wasn't a huge fan of the organization before, but now they're a huge supporter. And, it's not about that. I mean, everyone wants the same thing. We all want good trails and we want trails to be open and rideable and everything else. And so it's awesome to see that and, people to kind of level with each other and be like, you are all right. It's A-okay. So, and I'm just super thankful for all of our volunteers. There have been people out there day after day after day. I mean, Jared Hartman has been out there far more than, I would have expected him to be, even as paid staff. And he's constantly organizing and working with others and, talking to the other volunteer groups in the Forest Service and just checking and making sure everything's done. And then, Natalie and Stacy, our other paid staff, they've also been, coordinating at a high level and working to ensure that resources are in place and people are, everyone's doing what they need to do. And it's all happening and it's been good.
Well, Daniel, I really appreciate you reaching out and prodding me to get this one put together because it's something I've been thinking about. But at the same time, I didn't want to, jump down your guys' throat and be like, hey, let's do a story on this.
I think everyone's been pretty respectful with that. I mean, even Brian Park over at Pink Bike, he reached out and it's like, hey, how are you guys? And, he's checked on us for a couple of weeks, before, he's like, hey, would you be interested in writing a story? I was like, well, I'll come out of retirement for that, I guess. And, I wrote a little piece on Pink Bike, kind of, and this was a few weeks ago, kind of what the state of things were then and everything. And, it's just, it's good to see the unity and everything. And that was pretty well received. So,
well, and that brings up a good point. We're going to link that article that you wrote because it was an extremely well written article. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just trying to do what I can, and communicating kind of what's going on is one of those things. I told Brian I'd do another article, but we've been pretty busy. I'm trying to turn him into a podcast now.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just have him share this.
Yeah, that'd be incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. See what we can do.
We're closing this thing out with unity in the community, what it's brought together for people and the fact that people should come visit, responsibly.
They absolutely should. And, don't expect to see it be all that much different, but at the same time, be prepared for it to be a little different in ways. And just, I think, be patient with people. I started to catch myself getting frustrated because I planned poorly and left too late to go to a meeting the other day. And, they're doing road work. There's road work happening everywhere up here right now. And, it's kind of sporadic, things got patched and fixed, to get you by and get people one place to another. And maybe it's like a 1-lane road in places. And so they're coming back through and doing that. And it's not like there's a big announcement like, hey, this road's going to be closed this day. I mean, there are a couple of those, but they're just getting stuff done. And so just be patient,
Yeah. Well, Daniel, again, I really appreciate all this.
Yeah. Thanks, Josh.
We'll get this out and shared with the masses. And I think people will hopefully get a better understanding. There's also another, the Pisgah podcast did another really good episode on.
They did.
With various people and leaders within your community. And so I have to give, props to Mangler over at the Pisgah podcast for putting on an excellent episode as well.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We talked to, 6 or 7 people and, all their different stories, which is really neat to see and hear. And I think things are continually getting better. And thanks for being willing to share everything. And we can get people back here, it'd be good, because I know the businesses are struggling a lot. And we are hearing every day about, this restaurant in Nashville closed, or this, this little shop closed. And it's hard. I mean, I've heard statistics like 40% of small businesses don't survive something like this. And you don't see it at first. And that's the hard thing. You see all that catastrophic damage and the devastation. And this is kind of like this long, slow burn, really painful thing. It's like, well, everything's kind of back to normal. It's just empty up here and, people aren't coming and visiting. So,
yeah, well, I know where I'll be thinking about going next time I get to take a trip, which I always think about going to Pisgah anyway. So,
well, come on.
So, well, you guys have a great Thanksgiving. Hopefully people can show up. We'll get this one out. I really appreciate knowing how busy you are. I really appreciate you taking time to share the stories that you have with us. So it's
for sure.
Important.
Anytime. It's always a pleasure. So
thank you, Daniel. Thank you for listening. If you like what you've heard, please take the time to share these shows with others. Sharing these shows will help create awareness of both the guests who have taken the time to be on the show and the podcast series itself. Also, if you're new to the Trail Effect podcast, check out our ever-expanding library of episodes. If you listen to the Trail Effect podcast on Apple or Spotify, please don't forget to leave a rating and review, as this is one of the best ways to show our support for the Trail Effect podcast. Also, don't forget to check out Cooley Creative at www.dudejustsendit.com. For additional ways to help support the Trail Effect podcast, check out the affiliate links tab at the Trail Effect website, where you'll find links to Kettle Mountain Apparel, Worldwide Cyclery, and Trail One components. By using the affiliate links found at www.traileffectpodcast.com, a small commission will come back to the podcast, which will help keep this thing going. This podcast has been edited and produced by Evolution Trail Services. Thank you again for listening.